Thank you all very much. All right, so our challenge is we just had lunch. You're sitting in a darkened room, so your challenge is to stay awake, and my challenge is on top of that, I walked off a plane from California about 8 hours ago, so I hope that my material I presented for you today, or I prepared for you today, is entertaining enough for both of us. So if I start lagging or lulling, throw something at me or ask a really interesting question, and we'll continue on. All right, so let's get going on this. I want to change a little bit of maybe how you think about things, and I'm going to use this to start. This is sort of an interesting photo of some folks, no doubt, on safari. There's probably something really interesting on the horizon that caught their attention, their complete attention. I guess the point of showing this photograph is that, you know what, sometimes you need to make sure you're taking a look around and see if there's anything else out there that might present opportunity or threats. So let me show you another slide. This is fairly traditional data within most organizations. About 80% of it is unstructured, and about 20% of it's structured. And now every single conversation I've heard in here today so far has been, I presume, about structured data. Now when I listen to the conversation, I could put an unstructured hat on it, but I think most of it's really around how do I take things that are sort of nicely organized. In unstructured world, we say nicely organized as if it's all clean and ready to be used, structured data. And I don't want to get into the into any kerfuffles around semi-structured data and things like that, but some people will put that in structured, some people will kind of categorize it in unstructured. But the point being here really is that there's a whole boatload of data out there that many of us may not be taking a look at, and that makes it sort of the elephant in the room. So we spend all this time thinking about how do we get value out of the structured data that we have, how do we actually drive analytics, how do we bring more to our company, our organization, how do we derive benefits? And we sometimes forget about what that bulk of data is doing in our estate and what responsibility we have. So I think it'd be very interesting as a chief data officer to see where this fits within your responsibility. Now I travel the world and I talk to a lot of data officers and I get varying responses. You know, some, yes, this is absolutely part of what I do. I need to take ownership of this. Let's go. Others are, you know what, that's really should be in my realm, but I just don't have time. I'm busy enough just trying to deal with this structured data thing. To others, which is like, what do you mean unstructured data? You know, kind of what's that? So let me go through what I see as the unstructured data problems, some of the implications, and if I do this right, I'll actually have some time for some questions at the end here as well. So big problems. Unstructured data kind of ends up looking like your garage or public storage unit or whatever it is. Like you just kind of keep throwing stuff in there. And so the analogy between your personal life and maybe your professional life may work here. But most organizations, honestly, they have no idea what data they have. They don't even know why they're keeping it, but they do know one thing for damn sure. They're going to keep it forever. There's nothing that's going to cause them to remove that data. It's, again, until you move house or something like that, there's really not a reason to clean out your garage or your attic or whatever it is as well. And that leads us to problem number 2. Since most organizations have no idea where their sensitive, regulated, or most valuable information is, nor who has access to it. So if I use this analogy a little bit, if I look in your garage, are there any oily rags in there? Is your birth certificate in there? Perhaps some old bonds or something like that? There may be some things of value or of hazard lurking within your data. And really that's the challenge, because when you have a whole garage full, or if you have petabytes and petabytes of data, separating the really interesting stuff from the really worthless stuff is the whole challenge to begin with, isn't it? And then I was told Where's Waldo applies in Australia. Does this work? Okay, good. I want to make sure I didn't do a North American faux pas. I hope you guys aren't spending too much time following Waldo in here. He is in there. But honestly, when organizations need to find their information, it takes way too long and it costs way too much. And here's the paradox. You often return both too much data, too much of the wrong data, and not enough data because you miss some of the good stuff in there. And so you end up going on these huge expenses for whether it be outside attorney's fees or e-discovery costs, internal investigations, or it could be just finding data for business purposes, right? Internal use. And it takes a heck of a lot of time. Anyone find Waldo yet? Who's trying? Okay. All right. Thanks for being honest. All right, I appreciate that. Okay, so those are the fairly easy to understand problems of big data. I'm not telling you anything new. Hopefully I'm just bringing more attention to the subject than perhaps we often spend on it. But let's look at what the implications are. Let's just continue to ignore that elephant in the room. We don't really want to deal with this because you know what? It's hard. Not to say that structured data is easy, it certainly isn't, but unstructured data has a different set of somewhat unique challenges. And it'd be better if we just, let's let someone else worry about that, let that one slide for a little bit longer. Well, we can just keep doing the same thing we've been doing for the last 10 years or so, 15 years, 20 years, I guess, depending upon how old your company is or your organization. Just keep buying more storage. I have a customer right now that we're working with. Now they're on the larger side, grant you this, North American financial services company, 50 petabytes of unstructured data alone. That's how much storage they have in their filers and whatnot. They actually have 1,400 filers spread across the globe. They have a team entirely dedicated to doing nothing but migrating data from their old filers that are being decommissioned onto their new filers that are coming up. A whole team that does nothing but move boxes from one side of the garage to the other side of the garage. Probably not the best use of resources, but they don't really feel like they have another option at this point because the CIO's hands are tied. His job is just to store this information, protect it, and make sure it's available. It's the business unit, it's the legal team, it's really the folks who provide governance of this data that say, really, you need to keep it. And really, that's the paradox here. So we can keep doing this, and there will be some people who will be very happy with that decision, I'm sure. And then, we look at the regulatory environment. I'm always fascinated when I travel, when I hear about new regulations and new things that apply to data. And I'm sure you guys could probably tell me a few more stories. It's easy in financial services, right? So there's fines galore around this. One of the easiest ones to pull up is something like an ING bank getting fined $1.2 million for deleting some emails between 2004 and 2008. Just so happens that there was some interesting stuff in those emails, but we'll never know because they were deleted. But it certainly applies outside of financial services. I've worked with oil and gas companies that are required to keep the inspection reports on an oil pipeline, more specifically the welds of an oil pipeline, to make sure that they actually meet the criteria, that they actually were good welds, so should that pipeline fail, they can actually demonstrate that they meet the regulatory requirements. Now, they're required to keep that for 10 years. At the end of 10 years, they may decide to get rid of it or not. But my point is, there are so many industry-specific regulations about either keeping or deleting or something data that it's pretty hard to keep up with. But the repercussions are pretty serious. And I think this is interesting, is most of us, and I'd say even in financial services, tend to think that's not going to happen to me. And I hope at least not on my watch. But I can tell you, I'm not in the insurance business, but you don't want it to happen to you, and you really want to be rolling the dice. You really want to be taking that risk. So the idea around the idea around regulation is a pretty serious one. Okay, and the last one is really threats. Again, a myriad of examples I could pull through here. I wanted to pull out something that has sort of hit my radar more recently. There's been several articles in the Wall Street Journal. I see it in the Financial Times as well. This is bank tellers. Right, so bank tellers who are taking advantage of their ability to access customer information. Right, so as customers come in, they can actually see a lot of personal information. They can use that to make withdrawals at other branches of the bank. They can use it for personal identity theft. But this is just one example. I mean, I'm sure you guys could come up with several examples you've heard of insiders who have way too broad of access to information and are pulling that down and doing something that perhaps your organization wouldn't like. Now, it may be financial records, it may be personal health information, it may be something that's, actually another one I think is quite interesting and recently was settled, was Kevlar, right? So some research having to do with the DuPont chemical process for creating Kevlar. South Korean company was recently, actually they pled guilty to taking that formula with the help of some insiders that were pulling down way more information than they should have. But they had access to it, and who was to stop them from doing that? So really, when you look at the vast trove of information that's just sitting out in those filers, you look at all the challenges around, do I keep it, do I delete it, who should have access to it, what regulations apply to it, the challenges are immense. And I haven't even gotten into your favorite subject, which is probably analytics. How do I actually extract value from this information and use it to make decisions in a proactive way? Well, I'm sort of a big fan of the crawl, walk, run, and so I'm not going to go into the analytics piece. This is certainly a space that we do a lot of work in as well. But that's really more future-oriented until we actually get our data governance and our data management under control. So those are some of the things that happen if we don't pay attention. So let's talk about dealing with the deluge a little bit now. So what we usually talk about is a few things. One, first of all, you need to have some visibility into your data. Just what is it that you have? And you kind of have two choices here, depending upon the size of your data estate. You can look really broad. Like I have, if you're that 50 petabyte company, you may just want to understand, like I just need to go an inch deep, but I want to go really broad and understand kind of generically what do I have across my estate. The other option is perhaps going really deep. I know there's a few areas that are probably really risky. Maybe it's finance, maybe it's marketing. Marketing always gets picked on, so the previous gentleman picked on marketing a little bit too, so we'll just continue the trend, right? So, maybe I just want to pick a few areas within my estate that I want to go deeper on. Or maybe it's some combination thereof, right? Maybe I'm going to go broad and try and get a good view of what I have across my entire estate, but there's also a few areas that I want to go deeper on. So I'd look at just try and understand what it is that is in your environment. And really, it's hard to go to step 2 until you really have some visibility there. What I found is when people try to write policies or they try and figure out, well, what should we do with all that data, and we just kind of do it generically without having a good idea of what exists, it fails pretty miserably. So what I'd say is, step 2 is take some action. Before you take an action, generate that plan, have a policy, like how old does data have to get generically before you delete it? What information is kind of interesting? What regulations apply to your organization or different departments within your organization? Have a conversation around that. And I'll get to more of that in just a little bit. But then you have to make some decisions around what you're going to do. Are you going to move the data? Are you going to archive it? I didn't put delete up here because a lot of people get the heebie-jeebies when I mention delete. So I love to talk about it. I've been talking about it for probably 7 years. I've yet to see someone actually hit the delete button because they're so freaking nervous that someone's going to get them. I hope it's different in your organization, but I'm hoping that someday we'll get to that confidence level where we can actually delete some data. So we can always pray. Change access policies, right? So I can't tell you how many organizations have seen that their default policies, I drop something into SharePoint or my file share or OneDrive or Box or whatever it is, and the default policies are way more open than any one of us would ever guess. So who should have access to, your top salespeople's earnings, right? Because in that region, look how great they did. And of course, some sales manager wanted to put that up on their share so he could share it with his direct reports, not the entire company. But honestly, he's inadvertently shared it with the entire company. That may not be something that you want. And then maybe start assigning retention if you can. This could be a manual process. This could be automated process to some degree. But really what you want to get to is that control. Once you have a good solid system that can see what the data is, can actually assign some actions to it, hopefully the policy can just go and run on its own. So you don't get in this you don't maintain this 30-40% data growth per annum. Because pretty soon, if you wait long enough, and it may not be too long for some of you, you'll be that 50 petabyte company. In fact, it'd be kind of interesting if you guys did some back of the envelope. I don't know where you're starting off today, 100 terabytes, 500 terabytes, 1 petabyte. But this is sort of the old, if you had a penny and doubled it every day, how long would you take $100,000 or would you take, the penny doubled every day at the end of the month? So imagine if you start off with 100 terabytes and it's growing, okay, not doubling, but growing at 30-40%, that's a pretty healthy clip. That's exponential growth. See where you're going to be. What's your company look like? Are you ready for that data growth? And it's not even just the data and the storage, it's what's the information in there and how do you manage it? Okay. So this is an example of what, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, but if you look across, I'm just going to say look across the top. Relatively small organization, only 21 terabytes of data, but look at how much is orphaned. Orphaned is, it was owned, quote unquote, by someone who's no longer with the organization. They've since left. How much of it's stale, right? In this case, hasn't been touched in 3 years or more. Or how much is non-business? In this case, it was audio and video files, right? And some combination thereof. So this is just a high-level visibility that you might want to try and get within your organization. When I talk about broad visibility, this would be the type of broad visibility I'm talking about. So when you take that kind of report, I also want to make this a little bit realer and talk about a few customers that we have and their actual data. So some of this is pretty early on. So again, broad brush. First customer, 45 terabytes of data. For them, 34% was stale. I'm not going to go into all the details of orphaned and the rest of it, but that was a fairly large chunk for them. Customer B, 80 terabytes, again, 45% stale. Customer C, 151 terabytes, 47% stale. I guess the point I'm trying to get to this is you often read about averages. And I'm a guy who's kind of tired of listening about averages. In fact, I'm guilty of showing it even before, right? I said, hey, look, typical organization, 80% of your data is unstructured, 20% of it's structured. well, that's an average, and it may or may not apply to you. So I really wanted to get some real situations that I can say, I can actually tell you for certain that in these organizations, the amount of data that's 3 years or older was 47% in the case of this. And you think about how fast information is being generated, that's a pretty big number, but it just keeps growing. I mean, there's lots of interesting anecdotes I can give around here too. There was one company, a North American company, but they have data centers in Tokyo and as well as in Europe, in Dublin. And they actually found shares where 73 to 90% of their data was actually stale. They found servers they could probably decommission just because the information on it was sold and no one touched it in so long. I mean, I realize this is kind of IT centric, but if you start thinking about the information risk or the liability risk there, which this individual wasn't interested in, he sat in IT, there's probably a lot that's going on there as well. Actually, there's another European company that was kind of interesting. They have 5 petabytes of data. They had a target of trying to reduce that to 3 petabytes, so a reduction of 2 petabytes. They did a similar exercise to this. They ended up removing about 880 terabytes of data, actually after phase 1. So phase 1 was doing just sort of a broad sort of analysis, find redundant, orphaned, kind of trashy type of data. And so they had a pretty big reduction. They haven't yet gone on phase 2, which is actually starting to go into the content, do contextual analysis, and classify the data and move on. But pretty big reduction for them as well. All right, I'm doing well. Okay, so this is where I want to get to the meat of things and see if I've inspired any questions yet. So next 90 days, if I were you, what would my recommendation be? What would I look at if I cared about unstructured data? I'm hoping I've at least piqued your interest in saying, maybe I should look at unstructured data, or at least find who the person in my organization is who should be looking after it. So first step really is understand what it is that you have. That's that visibility step. Develop a plan for getting that visibility of unstructured data, including where it's kept and who has ownership of it. In fact, I've heard that ownership question pop up a couple times, which is always kind of interesting. There's the who stores it, who governs it, who has control over it. That's always an interesting one, which gets us to the next one, which is know the influencers and start that policy discussion. It is never easy to get different groups within any organization to kind of agree, but data is an interesting spot to see that come to life. I actually think that as CDOs are just getting started here right now, in many organizations, I realize in others it's been around for a long time, I feel like CDOs could declare a mandate. I feel like this is an opportunity to actually take some charge, to be proactive around how data is actually managed and bring the other parts of the organization together. I mean, the alternative is, again, it's an elephant in the room, it's just going to leave it there and let it continue to grow. Now, I don't know what your mandate is, and like I said, all the CDOs I've met, it's kind of been across the board. Sometimes they say, I don't care about unstructured data, all the way to the, yes, it's a core part of my job, I need to get this one right. But wherever you are, it's not going to solve itself, not without proactive interest. Your general counsel or your risk officer, your IT lead or CIO, they're not going to come to an agreement just by wandering around the hallway or meeting in the elevator. It's really going to take some concerted effort. So I'd say understanding who those influencers are and what their challenges are, and using the CDO mandate will really help with this. And I have seen that happen a few places, right? So not everywhere. I think it's still nascent, but I have seen a lot of development in that space. And then I think the other thing is, I'm going to keep with this elephant theme. How do you eat an elephant? Anyone? One bite at a time. Thank you. All right. We got a couple people are still awake. That's just it, right? So this is the kind of thing, like many of our data challenges. It looks like a huge, tremendous challenge. And if you try and tackle the whole thing, you'll never get started. It's too big of a hill to climb. I would strongly recommend that you find a little corner of your data that you can find some early success on, right? So I'll give you some examples that almost seem anachronistic, right? So we've got companies that have petabytes and petabytes of PST files or email files stored on their file systems, right? And I'm sorry, I've been in this business for a little bit of a while now. And PST files are something I thought we talked about in 1990, maybe 2002, 2005. I can't believe I'm still having conversations around PST files. Can I not have that conversation anymore, please? Because this should be a solved problem. But maybe that's a good place to go tackle, right? Your filer is the wrong place to store mail. Mail is something that is usually pretty well regulated. You can probably delete that or at least archive it after 2, 5, 7 years, whatever your company's policy is. Go tackle that. you'll find that that's potentially a really quick early win, unless hopefully you're one of the companies that's already solved that problem, and I don't have to have that conversation with you. But there's probably other things out there. Sensitive information is a really fantastic one. I've had a lot of conversations with healthcare recently. I'm amazed at where, well, in the United States, there's a lot of regulation around personal health information, and I'm amazed at how it's stored and just kind of thrown on top of this information pile, this heap, and really unmanaged. And it's really, I think, a problem waiting to happen, and I really hope it doesn't happen to anyone in this room, but I worry about that. So I'd say pick a few spaces, and then figure out where it is that you might be able to have an early win. All right, so I think I've gone reasonably quick enough to leave some time for Q&A. I don't know if I've inspired any questions, so I will stop and see what you guys have for me. I can ask myself questions, but they're not as interesting.
Thanks, Greg. Any questions from the floor? I've actually got one for you. Talking about healthcare, the problems that have become apparent from all of the new players that went into the medical records sector in the US, and how there was a missed opportunity for oversight and for enforcing security in a lot of the medical records software that's been developed as part of that Affordable Care Act rollout.
That's right.
Yeah.
So is the question...
just some general comments on your experiences and maybe what your organisation is doing to help address those issues.
Yeah, so, the ADA, sorry, not the ADA, not the Americans with Disabilities, but the Affordability Act, brought some really interesting things to the forefront. One of the things that I really was interested in is really trying to capture all the data that we have around treatments, what treatment works and what treatment doesn't work. And so in the excitement around gathering this data and kind of doing the same thing that you guys are probably trying to do for your organization, but across an industry and inspire this, they did create some pretty real challenges, right? So as we've put more and more information into electronic format, we've done a couple things. One, most of these organizations were wholly unprepared for this deluge of data, everywhere from the data collection standpoint, right? So doctors and nurses carrying around some well-designed, some less well-designed systems for capturing that information. But once it's captured, where is it stored and who has access to it? So again, not really well thought out. And then really we haven't started yet to see the benefit of collecting that data and looking at more scientific, appreciation of, this treatment for diabetes may worked really well, whereas this other treatment didn't. So I think we'll get there. I think we're still through part of the learning. For the element that I'd take a look at, and that is just how are we holding on to this data? How are we making sure that it's dealt with in a sensitive manner and then made available for analysis? I think that there's a lot of room for us to improve there. And that's why I'm starting to have a lot more conversations, especially with healthcare providers, hospital systems, some on the insurance side as well, because the insurance companies are very interested in how they harness this data and get better efficacy out of the treatments that they have. So there's a lot of interest in healthcare, huge business.
Thanks, Greg. Any questions?
Maybe I can pull the audience in real quick if you guys don't mind. So you guys are all certainly interested in data. I don't get a chance to talk to 80 folks at once. I'm interested in understanding how do you guys feel like unstructured data is part of your mandate or your office's mandate, right? So the CDO office's mandate versus that resides somewhere else. Let's start with yes, it's part of my mandate. Or my officers. Let's say 30% maybe 40? Okay. How many people feel like, let me twist that a little bit. If it's not yours, how many people feel like they could point to who does own this? 2, okay. All right, so it's either in your office or we have no idea. Okay, interesting. Anyone feel like this is a problem in your organization? All right, the same 30%, no, I'm kidding. All right. Well, listen, I appreciate the time here. And if you guys have any questions, be happy to take them offline. I'll be around for the next day as well. Thank you guys very much.